Hello and welcome to the Apologetics 315 podcast with your hosts Brian Auten and Chad Gross. Join us for conversations and interviews on the topics of apologetics, evangelism, and the Christian worldview.
May I please see the storage facility, Mr. Pick?
Hello and welcome to the Apologetics 315 podcast. I'm your host, Brian Auten, joined by Chad Gross. How you doing, Chad?
I am doing well. Glad to be here.
Excellent. Well, we want to thank you for the feedback that we received on the podcast, for those who are listening. And thank you for your questions. We'll be dealing with a question today. Thank you for sending that over. The email address you can use is podcast@apologetics315.com. So, Chad, tell me what's been going on in your world this week.
Oh, I mean, not really much. I didn't mention this, I don't think, in the prior podcasts, but I'm an elementary school teacher. And so each week is really us trying to figure out what teaching elementary school is going to look like under COVID, updated COVID restrictions, rules and regulations and things like that. And of course, I'm all virtual right now, and I teach, as I said, elementary school. So it's very interesting having elementary age children on Zoom for 5.5 hours a day. It's always an adventure.
Yeah.
The things I see.
Nice. Well, speaking of the things I've seen this week, I saw this video of George Clooney, and it was one of those ones where I immediately sent to my wife to say, see, I'm just, see. You ever send a message? You send a link, but you don't send any information because it's like, see, here you go.
Absolutely. I'm just wondering what George Clooney could have been doing to prompt you to send that to Judith. That's what I'm trying to follow.
Well, the interviewer was like, so how you been dealing with the lockdown and stuff? And he's like, well, cut my own hair. And they're like, what? You cut your own hair? It's like, yeah, no, I've been cutting my hair for, 25 years. And he's like, yeah, I, when I was young, I bought this thing called a Flowbee. And she's like, no, is this Flowbee? He's like, yeah, this is Flowbee right here. I cut it with a Flowbee. It only takes a couple minutes. And she's like, whoa. And so the reason I said that to my wife is because I have a Flowbee.
Are you serious?
Home hair cutting. So, yeah, I've actually had that probably for 25 years. Like 5 years before we were married. So we've been married almost 20 years here. So I actually used the Flowbee today. Is the
Flowbee now? I'm not super Flowbee literate, so forgive me here if this is a silly question, okay? But isn't the Flowbee like kind of a vacuum cleaner for your hair or something? Like it sucks your hair off or something? I don't know.
That's sort of like on Wayne's World, Wayne's World kind of thing. Like
yes, exactly.
It certainly does
what
suck.
We're talking about.
Well, it's like these clippers that you just switch on, but there's a little hose attachment, and you plug your vacuum cleaner into it, and then there's like these little extension things that allow you to say, well, I don't want to cut any more than this, and then you just turn on the vacuum cleaner, turn on the clippers, and you stick it on your head, and it like sucks it up, and perfect haircut every time.
And this works.
It works, man. Wow. Now I don't always cut my hair with a Flowbee because you can't like layer things and whatnot, but it depends on your haircut, I suppose. But before lockdown, it was like maybe I'd cut my hair twice and then go to the barber, cut my hair twice, go to the barber just to keep it tidy because,
right.
all the little edges and things. But this is what we talk about on the Apologetics 315 podcast now. So this is the new format where we just talk about odd, crazy things. So I just thought I'd give you a little something to think about.
Well, I hope you felt justified and that Judith is more comfortable with you vacuuming your head now.
So anyway, Flow B, that's one thing that happened today. Another thing that I've been doing is reading through a book by Professor Richard Dawkins, his newest one, Letting Go of God. So, yes,
Daco,
a moment of silence. A moment of silence.
I just feel bad for you that you have to work through that. No, I'm just kidding. No,
I downloaded it a few months ago and I never got to it. And then we've lined up a great interview ahead for you guys listening and saying, hey, where's the interviews? Well, they're coming. These things take time. But no, Peter S. Williams has written a response to Outgrowing God, and it's called Outgrowing God with a question mark. So I'm going to be reading both those books in just preparation for that interview. And, it's kind of interesting. So far, my impression is that, it's kind of like he's just kind of saying the same stuff,
Yeah, that was going to be my question of how is it in comparison to the God delusion, for example.
I'm not far enough to say what it is overall, although you're hearing things like the telephone game. We can't trust the scripture because it's like the telephone game. You're also hearing things about like, I don't believe in Odin, and you're an atheist for all these other gods. It's like, okay, I've heard all of this before. It's just maybe this is just a repackaging.
No, I was gonna chime in. The thing that for me about Dawkins is that it's undeniable that if you look at some of his past writings and his field of biology, he has a gift for being able to communicate scientific information in a very easy to read, winsome kind of a way. What happens though is that it's really sad to see some of the content that he brings to the philosophy of religion debate, because the arguments are. And I'm saying this objectively. I'm not at all saying this against the person. His arguments are really bad. I remember reading The God Delusion and reading his central argument. First of all, I couldn't even figure out if it was a syllogism or if it was just a cumulative argument. I couldn't make heads or tails of it. I actually reached out on Twitter to atheists and said, do you guys know if this is meant to be a syllogism? Is this meant to be cumulative? How am I supposed to read this? And they weren't quite sure either. So it's frustrating to see that he brings such weak arguments to the philosophy of religion debate. It's almost, I picture him sometimes as, I remember when I first started playing tennis. And you watch tennis on television and you see at the time it was Andre Agassi was who I was watching. And of course, it looks so easy. It looks like you can just pick up a racket and go out there and swing and hit the ball and no easy. And so my stepfather had played and he decided to take me out and play. And shortly after, I realized that it wasn't nearly as easy as I thought. And when I played people who had actually played, they made short work of me. And I almost see Dawkins as kind of this person who I think the New Atheists, of which he was a part of, Harris, Hitchens at the time, who's passed since, and Dennett and Dawkins, they saw themselves as a response to 9/11 and religious fundamentalism, which I understand. But I think it was almost like he jumped out onto the court, if you will, without really being aware of how to play the game too well. And I think that comes through not only in his arguments, but also in the responses to his arguments. And I'm of course not talking about just the responses that people like Alvin Plantinga wrote. I'm talking about the responses that people like Michael Ruse wrote, who is clearly not a Christian, who's an evolutionary thinker. And so, I think for me, it's just frustrating to see kind of the weak level arguments, and it dumbs down the whole debate. Because I know that atheists online, I freely confess, if you're listening, that it's frustrating for you because you guys are reading people like Paul Draper, Graham Oppie, Michael Martin, and then you're wondering why why are all these apologists addressing Richard Dawkins? Like he's not even, our best guy. He's not even close to our best guy. I mean, I know that some atheists even freely confess that they find his arguments embarrassing. So maybe that's something that would be interesting to explore, is why do we address people like Dawkins? Why do you still see people addressing Hitchens, even though he's passed away? I mean, I know I definitely have some thoughts on that. What do you think?
Yeah. Well, I can only speak my impressions of the book so far. And I was on the elliptical listening to this for 17 hours. And so as I was listening to this, actually, it was just about 10 minutes, but as I was listening to it, I thought, this picture of a rake, or like picture came to me like, okay, here is Reddit, and you just throw a net and cast your net into Reddit land and just pull in all the memes and all the arguments and just categorize them and throw a book cover on it. And there's your book. So I got this impression that this is just represents a very popular, shallow collection of all of the internet arguments against God that are, if you, another word picture or, a visual that comes to my mind of someone has sort of got a piece of string and they just tie a knot in it and they keep moving down the piece of string and tying knots and tying knots, tying knots. And, to untie all these knots is a real pain because there's just there's so many like incorrect things here. It's really frustrating to read through it because it just is a collection of it's like, package up every little Reddit argument you can come up with, or be attacked by 10,000 trolls with a Reddit meme, atheism meme from Reddit, and that's sort of what you get.
Well, it's funny you mentioned Reddit, because I remember one of the things that I found baffling in the God delusion was at one point in the book, and I want to say it's maybe 3/4 through or near the end. It's been out for quite a while. It's been a while since I've picked it up, but he actually freely confesses that he's condemning the 10 Commandments and saying how primitive they are and how easy it would be to come up with a better version of 10 Commandments. And he actually says that he Googled a list. And it didn't take him long to find a list of commandments that was better than the 10 Commandments in the Bible. And I remember thinking a few things. I remember thinking, okay, one, I get that he's trying to say, look how easy it is because all I have to do is Google it. I understand the rhetoric device there. But then my second thing that I remember thinking is, can you imagine if someone like William Lane Craig or Rob Coons or, just name your Christian scholar in their book said, well, I Googled this to find this out about atheism. I mean, rightfully, atheists would not appreciate that, right? And so I just remember thinking I was kind of baffled by the fact that he would admit that, well, I didn't really put much thought into this. I just Googled it. Yeah,
so it'll be an interesting read. I'm really, hoping that there's more substance to it, just to engage with something new. But most of my experience so far has just been a feeling of frustration and, wow, you're doing that one again. Now, I could admit that maybe if an atheist were listening to me right now, they'd be thinking, well, this is the same thing as apologetics books. You just use the same arguments over and over. But my response would be, yeah, but these are good arguments. We're not making, some of these arguments that Dawkins making that the, thinking atheists would not appreciate. So Anyway,
Yeah.
it'll be great to get Peter S. Williams on to talk to him about it, because I want to hear his perspective. He wrote an excellent book called Skeptic's Guide to the New Atheism, or Skeptic's Guide to Atheism. And of all the different atheism books I read, that's my favorite. I felt like it represented some of the stronger arguments from the new atheists at the time, and took everything within context and addressed it really systematically, really effectively. So he's a great thinker. Looking forward to speaking to him soon.
Yeah, I would commend his book as well. One of the most delightful reads that I read in the last couple of years is C.S. Lewis versus the New Atheists. Mm-hmm. Williams obviously takes the arguments of Lewis and imagines that and looks at the writings of the New Atheists, and he goes about it with the point of view of how would the arguments of the New Atheists hold up against the arguments of C.S. Lewis. And it's just really well written. Anybody who's looked at Williams's work, his notes alone, his footnotes alone, make his work worth getting. They are exhaustive, and not only that, he writes with clarity. And he's one of my favorites. I got to be honest. When you told me that we were going to interview him, I geeked out a little bit. I won't lie about it. I did. So I'm very much looking forward to that too. And one of the questions I want to ask him, and maybe something we could explore, is I do see that criticism of, why do apologists, the new atheist movement is mostly dead, is the claim made. And so we've moved on past that. Atheism now is more philosophically astute. And I am certainly sympathetic with that. But so why do apologists spend so much time addressing their arguments? And that's definitely something I want to ask Williams, but also something that might be fun for you and I to talk about.
Yeah. Well, I think it's my first impression is simply that, if there's sort of a battlefield, you've got all kinds of different sort of ranks of soldiers, or so to speak, or maybe different battlegrounds to fight on. There's areas that are easy and let me rephrase that. I kind of see it like just different categories in culture. You've got media and creative areas that are sort of putting out content. You've got scholars who are putting out content. You've got popularizers. And I think no matter what level people are sort of putting out their volley, it needs to be addressed. You can't just allow it to creep in and just be accepted on that level. So like if there are people who consider him a good, legitimate source for how they think about atheism, then we need to address Dawkins. Maybe the arguments are simplistic, but then again, it's been how many years since the original God delusion? And maybe this is a new generation will pick this up. So I think that it's good to respond to whatever is coming out there, because he still is a big name, even though maybe those who've heard about him or been familiarized with him probably discount him in certain ways. So.
Yeah, I think for me, those are great points. I think for me too, that the new atheism, when we say the new atheism is dead, a lot of times what people like Justin Brierley, for example, of Unbelievable, he made a video called The New Atheism, What Happened? And, he demonstrates how the movement kind of petered out, if you will. But one of the things that I think, and it's a point that I've heard other apologists make or other thinkers make, is that even though Dawkins's work and the work of Hitchens or Harris in the realm of, I'm talking here religion, obviously, that their arguments and thinking may be dead among serious thinkers. Unfortunately, their work is not dead among internet atheists. Yeah. And so my kind of response to this idea of, well, why are you guys addressing the new atheism? there's so much better arguments. I readily agree with that. I'll say amen to that. However, when those arguments from the new atheists are coming to us, I also feel that I need to be able to respond to those thoughtfully and point them to a better way. I mean, I know I've been in dialogue with people who are just enraptured by Matt Dillahunty. And I wouldn't say that Matt Dillahunty, I wouldn't necessarily say he's a new atheist, but I also wouldn't necessarily obviously say that he's giving the best arguments. He's somewhere in the middle there. But they're very taken with Matt Dillahunty. And I almost want to say to them, have you not heard of Paul Draper?
Yeah. Well, one thing comes to mind. I hope I'm not cutting off too much. I'm not cutting you off here.
No.
But the idea that comes to mind here is that objections, real snappy objections, are real memorable, but the answers may not be. For instance, I wrote down something I wanted to actually address this week, and that's that, how many times do you hear extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence? Yeah. Well, that's still being thrown out here all the time. It seems I'm always hearing this, but snappy, quick responses aren't memorable, or having a good response to that. It always takes longer to untie a knot than it does to tie it. Want to hear my response to it? I would love to hear your response to that. Anyway, I was looking at this idea that, extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence. So here's a few things I was thinking about. How could you come up with a quick response that might be memorable? Because you could look at it philosophically and show that that's just not true. But will you remember the answer? An extraordinary claim comes to mind, like, hey, I won the lottery. That's an extraordinary claim, but what's the evidence for that? Well, here's a lottery ticket, Now you might want to go back and verify that and stuff like that. But, that's an extraordinary claim, but it does not require extraordinary evidence. I just need a piece of paper. The other thing was I might have, I have to think of who to attribute this to, but it was a great way to look at the resurrection, because that would be an extraordinary claim. An extraordinary claim would be that someone rose from the dead, but the extraordinary evidence would not be extraordinary. They would just simply show that the person was alive again. So if you imagine I'm walking around alive, that's not anything extraordinary. That's ordinary that I'm walking around alive, but just show evidence that I was dead, or then show evidence that I was alive. I think I heard someone say, we see this evidence all the time. We see evidence that someone's alive, and then we see evidence that someone's dead. But in the case of Jesus, we've just reversed the order. You know what I mean? But the evidence is pretty non-extraordinary, So I was trying to mull around ideas on how to quote that you hear so often. How could you respond to it in a way that's memorable? And I thought, well, the lottery ticket and just simply seeing someone alive is pretty ordinary evidence,
Yeah. For me, I don't know if you remember this, and I obviously don't remember all the particulars because it was literally years ago. But there was someone on Truth Bomb in the comments section who was making this claim. Extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence. And you and I engaged him in a dialogue, because I was like, it's a call. And you came over. And we were chatting with him. And one of the things that came to light in the conversation that I found very interesting is we merely started asking, well, what do you mean by extraordinary? So in other words, when one person A says, well, extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence. What do you mean by extraordinary evidence? And the answer that person A gives might not be the same that person B gives. And so my point in saying that is it's not as if that's really an objective standard. It's much more subjective. Evidence is person relevant. Some evidence may convince one person, but it may not convince the next person. For example, the evidence for Christianity, I find more than sufficient. Whereas I've shared it with other people. And sometimes I think because we're not just machines that we plug information into, they don't find it sufficient. And so this idea that we need extraordinary evidence is a very subjective claim. There's nothing objective about it. Kind of to illustrate that, and I'm not trying to pick on Dillahunty at all. This is just coming out, to the conversation, is he was in a debate with Michael Licona on the resurrection. And I'm not going to get this, word for word, but I'll get the gist of it. And they were talking about this idea of, miracles and extraordinary claims and extraordinary evidence. And Licona asked him, he said, if we were in this room, and again, those of you that heard this, I'm not trying to get it word for word, but this was the gist of it. Licona basically said, if I was standing on this stage, I was decapitated. You saw my head separated from my body, lying on the stage. You left the room for 2 minutes. When you came back, my head was attached. And it wasn't sewn on or anything. Like, my head was reattached. You couldn't even tell it happened. I was completely fine. And he said, and I told you that I saw someone when I was dead and that you knew, and that they told me something that only that person could have known. And I told you that they told me while I was dead. Would you believe that the supernatural existed? And he said, that would not be my first conclusion. No. And so to me, that's beyond extraordinary evidence. Right. I mean, I can't imagine that happening. And then also in a debate with Matt Slick, he was asked, if somebody was in front of you and they said, let this sea part in the name of Jesus, and the sea parted, would you believe that God existed? And he said, I would have to look at the naturalistic explanations first. So my point is, or something like that. So my point is that I find this claim, unless you're trying to somehow use, Bayesian probability, I find this claim very dubious because I feel like it's a subjective one. Does that make sense?
Yeah, definitely. Those are really good examples you're giving as well.
Yeah, I find it. And for me, the first time that came to fruition was in that discussion you and I were having with that gentleman. And we just started discussing with him, what do you mean by extraordinary? And he really couldn't give a great reply. And that got me thinking more along those lines. Now, again, I know that people do use probability to argue that, but that's kind of a different, route to go. So, yeah, for me, it's very subjective, and I just want to share the evidence. And I think if somebody's willing to weigh the evidence, that the evidence is going to win out, regardless of what we're talking about. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Yeah, I think it's one thing I want to talk about sometime in the future, maybe in the near future, is the relationship between of apologetics to evangelism, because it seems to me that if you want to just try to operate on academic or prove it sort of plane, and then it becomes a lot of semantics, a lot of that's insufficient proof, trying to tear holes in arguments and that sort of thing, versus, okay, there's definitely something more than maybe just logic running around in someone's head when it comes to, well, I could get my head cut off and sewn back on and tell you what your person knew, but I'm still refusing to accept the supernatural. Like, what else is going on?
So that's a great point. Great. And that was for me, that I think you're absolutely right. And I apologize if I interrupted you, but I completely agree that it is in that sense of, for me, if that's not going to do it, then is the evidence the problem? I would say no. Like, if that's not going to do it, the evidence is not the problem, because that should be sufficient evidence for any reasonable person,
Yeah. There's so much, for me, I see how apologetics is so helpful when doing evangelism, but at the same time, it's like you can use it as a tool for the specific situation for the specific person. It's almost like you've got this tool belt of apologetics. And when you're going about your daily life and you encounter someone and you're speaking with them, there's the personal relationship you've built with the person. There's your rapport, your own demeanor, the kindness you've shown that person, the prayer that you put into that relationship. And then there's maybe something that comes up. You talk about 10 things, and one out of those 10 is something intellectual, yet you were able to address it with an apologetic argument. Sort of on the ground, when you're in relationships with people, it's great to have that, but it's just one part of many facets of what is sort of affecting that person. And boy, there's the pastoral element and everything, and what's happening in that person's spiritual life or their history, and what is going on in their relationships or whatever, and how much of their life they've personally invested into having their view and it being very public. So there's a huge cost for that person to let go of their view, not just from a personal freedom standpoint or moral standpoint or, okay, I'm not the Lord of my life standpoint, but it's like public change, investment. There's a huge bunch of stuff going on. And there's where I'm always torn. Like, boy, when I'm looking at the arguments, I'm like, you just wish you could just, do the math for someone on a piece of paper and that would be enough. But it's not. It's just a facet or a tool or one element of the whole experience a person has. You know what I'm saying?
Yeah, I do. I think that you're making lots of great points. I mean, first of all, the idea that we've got to make sure that we're communicating to the whole person. This was a huge mistake I made when I first got saved, first came to know Christ. I was unfamiliar with, I had people talk to me about Christ. I had people talk to me about the danger of going to hell. I had people communicate that to me, but no one had ever said to me, did you know that there's actually evidence for this? Mm-hmm. And so when I looked into the evidence, and I think I've said prior, it was specifically the resurrection evidence and as evidence for the New Testament that impressed me at the time. That I assumed that everybody would want to know it. And so I naively just started going out and talking to people, in the same way that if you found a money tree, you would be going and saying to people, you guys, you're never going to believe this. There's a money tree growing downtown and they'll let you take as much as you want. And, I was going out kind of like that, naive to how divisive religion, talking to, truth claims, talking to people about truth claims can be, how upsetting it can be for some people. I was totally naive to all that. And so I quickly found out I almost approached people like they were, like you said a moment ago, like humanoids. And if I plugged in the right calculation, evidence plus reason equals Christian faith was my kind of, that everything would be well. And I quickly had to learn, there's a lot more to it when you're talking to a fully orbed person who has mind, body, and soul.
That's one thing I just like about the J.P. Moreland content, where he doesn't only address the academic aspects and the logical aspects, but there's a spiritual the spiritual side of things, and there's the emotional pastoral side. And I guess I would want to always emphasize to people who are going full on engaging logically, so to speak, or, just on the arguments alone, that's missing so much, that there should be a development of, apologetic arguments. I'm learning about apologetics. Well, how are you applying that to evangelism? How's your prayer life? How's your reading of the scripture? And are you praying for the person you're interacting with? And maybe the first question I'd want to ask, if someone said, hey, I'm interacting with so-and-so on the internet and trying to argue with them about such and such, I'd be like, how much time have you spent praying for the person? And maybe that would be a good starting point, just to say, well, you're missing something. There's more to it than just how do I win the argument. So,
yeah, right. And I freely confess. That was an error that I made early on, and I think that there's one person in particular in my life who for over 10 years. We've been talking about the truth claims of the Christian faith, and he's shared things that he wrestles with, and he's even changed positions a few times, and it's been definitely a wild adventure to watch. But one of the things that God has kind of impressed upon me as I've interacted with him is not only do you want to share the argument, share the evidence, but you also want to make sure that you let him know that, hey, I love you. I love you regardless of where you're at in this journey. I love you because I believe that you're created in the image of God, and therefore you have infinite value. And I think that he knows that he can share with me, and he can be, and I'm not tooting my own horn. I'm just saying that this is something I've learned. God has kind of shown me through this relationship of, he has to feel comfortable enough to come to me and say, I'm struggling with this. And we've had conversations of over a huge gamut of topics, and he knows where I stand very clearly on the topics, but we're able to disagree and do so disrespectfully. And our friendship's been enriched by it. And I, of course, continue to trust and believe that he'll come to Christ. One thing you were talking about, JP Moreland, I want to commend to our listeners on Apologetics 3:15. Brian actually wrote a review of JP Moreland's book, Kingdom Triangle. Now it's from 2009. But obviously the book hasn't changed. So if you want to learn more about JP Moreland's approach, the subtitle of Kingdom Triangle is actually Recover the Christian Mind, Renovate the Soul, and Restore the Spirit's Power. And so I recommend that review for you. You can find it on Apologetics 3:15 if you just look under the label JP Moreland.
Great. Yeah, that's definitely a great book, man. That has affected my thinking quite a bit. Yeah. Right. Well, I think,
and right now you're going. Right now you're going. I wrote a review for that. No, I'm just kidding.
No, sometimes if you wait long enough and then you go back and read your review, you're like, "Oh, that was pretty good. That was a good book too."
Have you had the other experience where you go back and look at stuff you've written and you're like, "Oh my gosh, I can't believe I thought that," because I know I have.
Oh man. Yeah. Okay. So I want to do two things. We'll shift gears. I want to share a little tidbit about reading, and maybe we'll bounce back and forth on that real quick. And then we'll go ahead and get our listener question for the week, which could turn into a little bit of a discussion here. Speaking of reading books, there was a little fun tip. I was looking for fun tips. And that's how to get more out of a book. So, dear listener, this is for you, and you too, Chad. One thing that always helps me when I'm reading a book or even listening to a podcast or something. Most of the books I'm reading these days, I'm not sitting down to read. They're pumping through my ears. I'm more of an audio person, mostly because of time constraints. And I'll talk about another tip after this. But one thing that helps me is to imagine that author is in the car with me. And while I'm driving to work or something and I'm listening to their stuff, how much attention would I give to that person's thoughts if they were sitting there? Okay, let's just pull a book out of the air. If it's Jordan Peterson, if someone said to you, "Oh, Jordan Peterson," now that's not apologetic stuff, but Jordan Peterson was sitting in my car and he was talking to me about all this stuff this morning. You would have been really attentive to that because that person was actually there with you. But if you're just like, "Oh, well, I was listening to a podcast or something," you kind of have a different sort of attention to it. So here's the experiment. And the next time you're listening to a podcast or an audiobook or something, imagine the person's there with you and you're respecting their time and you're preparing questions for them and you're thinking, "Oh, what would I say to this person?" Just a mental experiment to see how much more you get out of it. I don't know. What do you think about that, Chad? Too weird?
No, I don't think it's weird. And one thing that I like about it that comes to mind immediately is, we started out the podcast talking about the book you're reading by Dawkins. I think that you would interact with his ideas differently, perhaps, if he were sitting right in front of you. I think it's easy to read somebody who we don't agree with and to dismiss them too quickly. And I think that if you're imagining that person is sitting right in front of you and you see them as a person and not just words on a page, I think maybe it would help you take their ideas a little more seriously and take them more to heart. So no, I don't think it's silly or spooky at all. I think I'm a little worried about Jordan Peterson's all beef diet, but other than that, I don't think it's
okay. Here's a deeper nerd tip. And this one is
nerd tip.
This is a geeky nerd tip.
It's revenge of the nerds.
I always wanted to convert like audio or like like text into text to speech. And so there's a hack you can do on your iPhone where if you have a Kindle book, you can go into your settings and change the accessibility settings so that if you swipe down with 2 fingers, it will read what's on the page. And the Kindle app, if you swipe down on 2 fingers, if you have that enabled, then it will read the Kindle book to you. So that's great. And if you're willing to keep your app open all the time. So that wasn't good enough for me because it's like, okay, the app, if I stick the phone in my pocket, then it gets all messed up and stuff. So what I did was there's an app called Voice Dream, and there's another app called Calibri. So here's the tricky workaround, but you have to have the very second generation Kindle, right?
This is getting very complicated. No, I'm just kidding. Go ahead.
So if you have the second generation Kindle, you can download the Kindle book. Then you can transfer that to your, say your Mac or your computer. Use Calibri to convert the book from into EPUB format, and then you airdrop it to your iPhone and open it up in Voice Dream. So now you've got an audiobook version of your Kindle book. I know there's like 1% of you that might meet those specs, but it is a very helpful hack.
Could any of that help me expand the amount of storage in my storage facility? Because that's really what I need. That's really what I need help with at this point.
Well, the good thing is that, the good thing is you don't have to have all the books around you. But anyway.
Do you know what I'm hearing? You know what I'm hearing in my head right now? Do you know what I'm hearing in my head right now? May I please see the storage
facility? Why do you want to see the full storage facility? Because I'm interested in what you read here.
Because I want to know what you people do here.
Oh, man.
Gosh. Oh. May I please see the storage facility, Mr. Pick?
Why do you want to see the storage facility?
Well, because I'm curious. I want to know more about what you do here.
Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and play the question from one of our listeners, Andrew, from Northern Ireland. Here we go.
How can I influence Christians to explore their faith intellectually and their theological beliefs with a philosophical bent? Should I resign myself to complete disappointment with the broad evangelical movement? Or is there any hope to redeem it when it comes to thinking deeply about faith? Where are all the spiritual fathers and mothers in the local church, and to broaden the scope in the evangelical movement, who can lead those coming behind them into an intellectual faith, to be able to bring them through questions and exploring answers and pointing to the best explanation? Suppose the scope here really first and foremost is the local churches within the evangelical movement.
Okay, well, thanks so much for sending in that audio. It was sort of a 3-part question. And the first part of that was how can I influence other Christians to explore their faith or their belief with intellectual and philosophical bent. Do you have any preliminary thoughts on that, Chad?
Yeah, and I like how you use the word preliminary because that's what I was going to say. First of all, Andrew, I can't tell you how much I sympathize with you. Even as I was listening to the question, I can hear in your voice a sadness, a disappointment, a desperation, and that weighs heavily on me. And I feel for you and as a brother. And so I appreciate you reaching out. So I just wanted to say that. But I want to take a step back. And I hope this isn't a bit of a rabbit trail, but I think it addresses much of what you're saying. It's funny, we kind of had a Greg Kokel theme in one of our podcasts. It seems like JP Moreland's name is coming up a lot here. But in his book, something that really helped me with this, because I shared when I came to Christ, I shared some of the struggles that you're having currently. And in some ways, I still do. But especially with this question of this disappointment with the evangelical movement, especially as an intellectually rich faith. And I did find it difficult to influence other Christians to dig deeper philosophically, theologically, apologetically, if you will, into their faith. And one of the things that helped me is that in J.P. Moreland's book, Loving God with All Your Mind, he actually lays out how when the Christian faith began, it has a very rich intellectual history. And I'm sure you're familiar with some of this. And he actually, without going into detail, he breaks down where we got away from that in history. And he lays out a plan, if you will, for how we can rediscover that. And it made me feel like I was part of a small remnant, if you will, to rediscover what has always been an incredibly intellectually rich faith. And one just needs to look into Christian history to see that. And so I think understanding how we've gotten where we are, because the church admittedly has dropped the ball in this area. You're absolutely right. One of the questions that I had when I first came to Christ was, okay, why isn't everyone talking about the evidence for the resurrection? Why isn't everyone talking about arguments for the existence of God? Now, I don't mean that's the totality of your faith, but why isn't that an integral part of it? And it really helped me looking into that, the history of it, and seeing that, again, historically, the Christian faith is very intellectually rich. There is a point in time that we dropped the ball there and we went away from the intellectually rich faith and started moving toward feelings and experiences. And we're seeing the fruit of that right now. But I do believe it can come back. And Moreland lays out some of the ways that we can work. And we'll get into more of the specifics. But those are just some preliminary comments that I was thinking that I hope are helpful.
Yeah, I think that's really good, Chad. I'm having a few preliminary thoughts too. One thing would be, if you're talking about how to influence others, people have their own personalities, and some people are just not going to go down certain roads. I think people are different. So there's going to be some people who might just be waiting to find that part of their faith expression or explore their faith that way. They're going to be more open to some intellectual approach to their faith, which upon finding apologetics or philosophy or looking at their faith with a more intelligent side of things or an intellectual side of things, that will just that person will be like, okay, yeah, this is great. This is something I've been waiting for or looking for. So I think maybe just asking really good questions. Hey, did you know that so-and-so wrote in this book about this topic? And, here's how they look at it, or here's how Augustine looked at it, or here's how John Wesley approached the subject, or you name it, William Lane Craig or whomever. So there's that aspect where just you being the sort of person who approaches your faith with an intellectual vigor and philosophical sort of angle, that's going to influence people, because who you are helps to change the people around you. You can't change them, but who you are makes a difference.
Right.
I guess one on the opposite side of that is that it is possible to turn people off about taking an intellectual look at faith by just smothering them with, that being the only angle that you're able to look at things from. So connecting, developing rapport with other Christians on the level they're at, and then being the person you are is going to open them up to those things that they're willing to be opened up to in an intellectual or philosophical angle. That's my take on it.
Yeah, let me share this as maybe a point of encouragement, Andrew. When I initially got saved, and this was a few years after, because I did a lot of investigating and searching, and I've always been a constant questioner. And so my church got to the point where I was feeling kind of that lack that I think you're expressing, where I knew that there was this rich intellectual heritage that we had, and I didn't see it was being really invested in our congregation or taught. And so what I did is I started just a small apologetics group and at my church, and I went to my pastor. I asked for permission. He was okay with it. And we were in a church of over 250. And when we first started meeting, we had like 4 people. And, I could have went 2 ways there. I guess I was a little discouraged at first, but over the years, that grew until we had Sunday school classes that were about 20, 25 people. And we were doing debate analysis, and we were looking at the reliability of the New Testament through working through J. Warner Wallace's work. And so my point is that you start small, start with a remnant, even if you have a small number. I mean, Jesus started with a small number, right? And you might be surprised. I think Brian makes a good point that people may be hungering for this and not even know it. And maybe if they know that there are avenues that they can exercise that part of their faith, that they'll take advantage of that.
Okay. The other second part of the question was almost sort of, I don't have the exact words in front of me, but it's almost like, well, should I give up hope? Should I give up hope in the church? Should I resign myself to this idea that, the church is simply not going to engage like it could, or maybe he's thinking that it should. Do you have any preliminary thoughts on that, Chad? Kicking it back over to you.
Well, that's thanks. No, I freely confess that's something that I think there's hope. I do think there's hope. And here's what I'm basing that hope on. I'm basing that hope on the fact that I hear people like William Lane Craig say that there's been this Christian renaissance that's been going on in Christian philosophy. And it takes about 10 or so years for that to trickle down to the layman, if you will. And so I see some positive strides in the intellectual community of the faith. If you look at Brian, when Brian started Apologetics 3:15, one of the reasons he did that was because he kind of was looking around the internet, and there wasn't really a whole lot of what he felt like, and you can, of course, correct me here if I'm wrong, but there was no site that you could go to and find the plethora of resources. And so he started building that. Well, now, gosh, it's 10 years later or so, and there's resources all over the place. And so I know that in your kind of microcosm, your own situation, you may not be seeing a lot of growth in that area. And of course, you can continue to pray that will happen and take steps on your own to make that happen. But I think in the broad picture, that is happening. And I think sooner or later, that's going to begin to trickle. I think what Moreland argues is beginning to happen, that we're beginning to reclaim our intellectual heritage. And so I think there is hope. So hang in there, I would say.
My thoughts on this are twofold, 2 prongs at the moment. The first aspect is don't give up hope. All right, maybe you're not finding what you want to find right around you, but you're thinking about right now. So in the future, that could change. But it's only going to change if some people If it's not you, it's going to have to be some people making that change to change the culture or the environment within either your home church or the church at large or in the community or globally or whatever. So it's only going to change in the future if people do it. So you can wait for them or you can do it somehow to some extent. Now, the other thing is thinking about when it's going to happen. Are there times where it has already happened? So look back and say, well, here's a point in church history when it was intellectually rigorous or philosophically, robust or whatever word you want to use there. Look back in history and start taking in these authors, if you want to read through all the Thomas Aquinas or Augustine or, the different Christian philosophers or theologians through history, and let them be your mentors, let them be your guides, so to speak. And I'm kind of tying this into the final part of the question where it's like, where are the spiritual fathers and mothers giving guidance? And interestingly, it ties into that little reading tip where imagine that person that you're reading, imagine, St. Augustine there with you in the car, there's your spiritual father or mother. If it's not someone in your church or locally or whatever, if you don't have those relationships, then that's one avenue. And that may sound like, well, that's easy to say. Well, how many people have written to say William Lane Craig and the podcast and be like, oh, you're like a mentor to me. You're like a father to me spiritually and, or intellectually, and how much influence you've had by listening to your audios and your lectures. Doesn't have to be someone you know personally. You can be mentored and fathered by others without them even knowing. Now, is that ideal? No, but considering the circumstances and the situation and considering the fact that those resources are available, who do you want to be influenced by? It's like, choose your media, choose your mentor, and then choose your media. If they're not in the flesh right there with you, then that's a way to start to glean and to learn from other people. And then again, tying back into that second part of the question, my thought is, what does that relationship look like? What sort of fathering or mothering influence do you want to have in your life? Think about it really detailed. What does that relationship pouring into you look like? Does it mean that you're getting phone calls from that person? Does it mean that you're answering people's questions, or they're answering your questions? You're getting guidance from them. What does that look like? Pray for it to happen, and then do the very thing that you're praying for yourself. So if the one aspect would be, well, I want someone to, be there for me and tell me how to go along in my faith. Well, there's those sort of relationships, the plus, minus, and equals comes to mind. The plus relationship is the people who are above you that can speak down into your life. The equals relationships are those relationships that are alongside, that are people and peers that are kind of on your level, and you can go on the journey with them. And then the minus relationships are those who might be below you in their, or behind you in their journey, and you can help them along. So the idea here is get real specific about what sort of relationships or mentors or spiritual fathers that you want in your life, and pray specifically for that, and then embody those things to other people. A lot of, I think I was getting from the question is sort of like almost a little bit of a lament, like a weariness of like I'm in the desert place.
I agree. I
totally feel that and have felt that. And, it's a season. And all I can say is that there's some things that you are in your control and some that aren't. And for the things that aren't, it's prayer. And, but for the things that are, there's more to it than you're allowing yourself to see. You can affect the things around you, and it can grow a lot bigger. And you can grow a lot bigger from just making certain things happen yourself. I hope that doesn't sound too like putting it all back on you or something, but that's just kind of like how I'm seeing it right now. And what do you think, Chad?
Yeah, that's a point that I was going to bring out too, is that, obviously, I can honestly say that in my life, I don't have a spiritual father who is discipling me intellectually. If that makes sense. That's just not something that I have in my life right now. And so I do lean on people like, William Lane Craig and other Christian intellectuals and theologians who I do learn from. And I find that, of course, I agree with you 100%, Brian, that's not ideal. It does at least fill some of that void and kind of give you some bearings to kind of direct you in the way that you should be growing. And I also like that idea that you made about, there are some things that you can do and there are some things that you can't change or influence. Pray about all of it, but, you give those things that you can't change or influence to the Lord, but then you do what you can do. And I agree with you that Andrew probably has much more of a sphere of influence than he realizes. And I think that him modeling what an intellectually fulfilled, spirit-filled Christian looks like may have more of an impact in the long run than he thinks.
If there's that voice in your head that says, I'm not going to do this because it's not going to make a difference, I just want to call that a lie. And, if that's going through your head, whoever's listening, if you hear this voice that says, I'm not going to do X because it won't make a difference, then I'm calling that a lie right now from Satan himself. Right. I don't know. Take that and seriously. If I didn't do Apologetics 3:15 because I thought it's not going to make a difference, well, there's certain people that means a lot to, and things that it's affected. There's a lot of things that all of us do where we don't think it's going to make a difference, and it's made a huge difference. So wherever you're at, back to Greg Coco Bloom, where you're planted, whatever you do is going to make a difference.
Well, and I think that, one of the things that Andrew brought up and throughout his question or questions, I guess I should say, is this idea of the evangelical movement, right? And obviously, I can only speak to that here with any kind of knowledge that is sufficient, I think, here in the States, obviously not in the UK. But I know that one of the things that's tempting here in the States is that you judge the impact of the difference you're making by size. So in other words, I have this huge ministry, or I'm reaching all these people. And I'm not suggesting Andrew's doing this, but what if Andrew is going through this dry season right now, enriching himself intellectually because it's somehow going to impact his kids? Or what if he's going through this to have one conversation with somebody who is wondering who may be the next great, man of God, if you will. We don't know the kind of the web that God is weaving. And so we don't want to measure. And again, I'm not suggesting this is for anyone, not just Andrew. We don't want to measure the impact of what we're doing, based upon the size or what we're even necessarily seeing, right? That's where faith comes in, where we want to say we're being faithful. We're doing what we believe God is calling us to do, and he's going to bring the increase. The rest is up to him.
Well, very good. Thanks very much for sending that question in. And if you're also a listener,
Andrew.
If you're listening and you say, well, I have a question or some feedback on the answer, that's fine too. So send your emails to podcast@apologetics315.com. And remember, if you incorporate some sort of Ghostbusters thing next time, I assure you it will be read. And the quality, we also guarantee 50% more quality of an answer.
Yes. Exactly. Yes. Have
Right.
some. Exactly. Yes. Yes.
Right. Well, thanks, listeners, for being with us this long. I know we're changed our format, but get ready. Lots of great things ahead. We mentioned the interviews coming up. Be sure to visit apologetics315.com for various resources, new updates, and hopefully some fresh stuff from the podcast, notes and whatnot, links that we might want you to find, and we'll pass along to you. Also visit Chad's website, Truth Bomb Apologetics. Where can that be found, Chad? And what might they find on Truth Bomb?
It's truthbomb.blogspot.com. A couple of the features that we have that people tend to like is we do worldview and apologetics in the news, which is just a collection each week of different news articles that kind of impact the Christian worldview, and then just resources and videos from various Christian thinkers.
Very good. Well, thanks so much for listening to the Apologetics 315 podcast, and we'll see you next time.
Today tastes like heading out the door and driving into town. It tastes like grabbing snacks and a Coke and singing as loud as you can. Today tastes like anything could happen. And it never tasted this good. Summer tastes better with Coca-Cola.
Wherever you're going this week, don't forget to grab an ice-cold, refreshing Coca-Cola.
We're momentarily taking over your favorite music station to deliver an important message from Polliner Grapefruit Radler Radio. What favorites do you rock in your summer mix? Do you have tracks that sound like this? Or something like this? Or perhaps this? Now, regardless of what your music mix sounds like, just make sure you cue this up. Sound good? That's a refreshing grapefruit radler. It's the perfect mashup of German lager and grapefruit, meant to be a part of your summer mix. And now, by following Polliner USA on Instagram, you'll have the chance to win summer music prizes. Just look for the Polliner Grapefruit Radler music post and play the fun trivia game. Correct answers are how you enter. Cue the legal stuff. Polliner USA, White Plains, New York. No purchase necessary. Open to U.S. residents 21 or older, excluding West Virginia. In 7/30/21. Void where prohibited. See rockthemix.com.